Are we going to do this thing?
We're ready.
Let's do this thing.
All right, I'm excited.
Okay. Gender. So are we showing the show, or are we just going to watch this video? What shall we do? We're going to talk about Houston. And the thing that no one knows about Houston is that the only reason the city is here is because there's a port. However, if you live in the city of Houston, you would never know that there's a port. And I think that's as a team, when we were trying to figure out what to do for the summer program, we found that kind of an interesting conundrum. Most of the economic engine of Texas, it comes out of Houston. Right now, Houston's one of the few ports that actually exports stuff to China and other places. And what we tend to export is resins, which means, if you have an iPhone or if you have a computer or a telephone or whatever, it's got plastic on it. It's made out of resins, and those resins come from oil, and they tend to make those here in Houston. They put them in giant containers, and they ship them all over the world. And then, of course, they come back from China or Japan, wherever, as actual plastic stuff. But yeah, we found it kind of fascinating that there was this port that no one seems to know about, and it's the economic engine of Texas and certainly the city. We also, if you kind of look at things that, say, the GSD has done over the last, 5 or 10 years, they've looked at different kinds of landscapes and tried to figure out what landscape architects, what sort of point of view they might have on them. So there was a few years ago, a deal on like airport landscapes and like what do landscape architects have to say about that. So it was kind of playing into that a little bit about ports, right? Landscape architects don't tend to design ports. We don't tend to be engaged in the master planning of them. So the question was, is there a role for us? And if so, what might it be? Then there was the summer program that we had decided to take on, so we decided to put the two together. Now, traditionally, when SWA does their summer program, it is 4 weeks of principals in our firm helping students to do a student project. What we said this year was, there's been some interesting things that have come out of those, but rarely has an actual project come out of them. In some cases they have, but rarely has there been an actual project that comes out of it. It tends to be some really, some interesting student work. We said, let's spin it backwards, and let's say that we'll have interns come and help SWA principals do a professional project. So we contacted the port, said, hey, we got this pro bono effort we'd like to do for you guys, but we wanted to look and feel like it'd be run like a real project. You guys are a real client. They agreed, and it was kind of interesting because I don't think anyone had ever gone to a port, or at least this port, and said, hey, you guys are interesting. There's really interesting things that go on there that people don't know about, and we'd like to figure out how to work with that. I think they feel like they're sort of undervalued or misunderstood. So it was kind of an interesting dialogue with them from that point of view as well. So what we're going to look at today is the results of this process that we went through. What's happened is by doing this 8-week program instead of a 4-week program, we were able to dig a lot deeper into the project. By having students sort of work for us instead of us work for the students, I think the work is much better. And I think the most important thing is that at the end of this process, Michael, Amna, and Natalia basically have converted this into a real project. And so now the Port of Houston is hiring SWA to participate in their master plan. So we're working alongside engineers to do all the sort of standard engineering type things that you do with the port, but our point of view is so different that they've really been engaged and energized by that. So do we have a PowerPoint we'll kind of jump into? We'll go through this quickly. So this is our poster that we sent out, inviting students to come to Houston. They didn't quite know what they were going to get into. I think we worked them pretty hard. This was our key team, which was myself, Natalia, Amna, and Michael. And each of us tried to work at a different scale or different types of information that we were bringing to the students. And this was our student team that we put together. So we had, we made an effort to make sure we had a lot of diversity in our team. But we had students from Asia, we had a guy from Egypt, someone from Arizona, is that right? And the lady on the left, I forget, is she from Berkeley? Minnesota. But she went to school at Berkeley? Yeah. But they each brought, the other thing we looked for, we weren't just trying to get, who has the best graphics, who has the coolest portfolio. What we said is that this is a professional project we're trying to do. They need to work together like we do as professionals, meaning I need someone that's good at writing, and I need someone else that's good at AutoCAD, and someone else that can do fantastic illustrations, and someone that's good at numbers. So that was our approach to trying to put this team together, and I think that's also what made this a fairly successful summer program.
And I would want to add that by the end of the program, I think the students were ready to start their own firm. Yeah. Because they gelled as a unit, they understood the teamwork that goes into execution of every project, and that was a really great thing to see.
So this is us at the Port of Houston. So the lady in the yellow jacket, she's a lady, but she is the chairman of the port, and she's very specific that she is the chairman. So you have to use the proper language. She's a bigger-than-life person, and it's a very political position. I think I forget who she's appointed by, but there's governors and presidents and all kinds of people that interact with the chairman of the port. But she was very helpful in, again, helping make this project real. So this is our team with Chairman Longoria. The guy in the front, right next to her, to the left, he's a city councilman, David Robinson, that we do a lot of work with here. And then all the various people, like their infrastructure people and whatnot in the port. So I think, like we said earlier, the previous years and stuff has been more student-driven project. This year, the idea was make it professionally driven, so that after this, someone would end up paying us to keep going with it. So we did an 8-week process, whereas I think historically we've done sort of a 4-week process with the students in 4 weeks in an office. We said we're not going to go to an office this year. We're going to keep them here for the full 8 weeks. All right, next one. Oh, okay. I'll lean in. How's that? Somebody wrote a book about that. The Houston Ship Channel. So basically in 1900 or thereabout, there was an enormous hurricane in Galveston. And Galveston was, it was like the New York of the Gulf Coast. And it was wiped out. There was nothing left. And so Houston said, oh, this is an opportunity. We should build a port in Houston. And that port went all the way up Buffalo Bayou to downtown. And that was part of the reason we wanted to do this project. We've done all this work on Buffalo Bayou, but we've never, and no one's, from a design point of view, has ever looked at the port from a landscape or design point of view. So that was our idea. But this thing is, oh, okay. I don't know what slides people are showing me, so I'm just jumping around here, guys. So why the port, right? So logistics, it's a very complicated business. Again, something we don't typically get into, but it does affect the way cities work, right? So the port brings in all these goods and services, but then it gets put on big trucks, right? And so we're doing a lot of work with freeways projects in downtown, where people live, where they work, but the truck traffic impacts all of that. And then it also gets put on trains. So there's all these different types of infrastructures that we have to deal with. We like the idea of redefining a port landscape as a landscape, because traditionally it's not, it's just this kind of leftover place. And I think the other thing that kind of got us excited about it was just research. How do we take research into a port and turn it into a practice area for SWA? And I think we've done that just because, for no other reason, they've hired us, and we're talking with other ports as well now. This is, what Houston looks like. You can see on the far right some cranes in the background. Everything's dead flat. You see these huge ships carrying natural gas, or that was probably empty coming in, and it'll go out full of liquefied natural gas. But that's Galveston Bay. It's a big part of the reason that Houston is here. It makes it livable. There's food and recreation, you know, that are all in that bay. That was a big part of our study as well. We talked to all these different little cities, and that was the other great thing about how we took this project on was, you know, we met the mayors of, I don't know, 8 different small towns that are on the bay and that line the ship channel. And when you meet mayors and small city councils, they all have parks and trails and things they want to build, and the port oftentimes gives them money to do those sort of things. So that's, again, helped put us in the driver's seat to do more of this kind of work that we want to do. What are these things? Oh, the different weeks, yeah. So week 1, we looked at, just sort of analyzing the infrastructure. How big are the ships? How deep is the ship channel? This ship channel is constantly being dredged. The only way it operates is if every day somebody's dredging. It's got to be 45 feet deep. As ships get bigger and deeper, you know, you have to do more dredging. But trying to understand all that infrastructure was a big start to it. Week 2, we went out to the bay and we started to meet with Audubon Society and other people that have an interest in the bay. And then we started to look at how these enormous chemical plants impact the bay. You know, they provide a lot of funding to rebuild habitats, but of course, at the same time, they also, you know, create a lot of pollution, both in the water as well as in the air. This is sort of the municipality, so then we went and met with all the various mayors and the municipalities that surround the ship channel to understand their issues. And then at the end of it, we did a big presentation. And we had the county commissioners came, we had city council people, we had all these people from the port, different mayors and organizations from different cities around Houston that showed up. And so it was a big deal. And again, we really used it to try to say, look, SWAs, you know, we're the guys at the leading edge of infrastructure and understanding what that means to cities.
Now, yes, and I think now we are going to get a little bit into the project itself. And here on the screen right now, you see kind of an innovative way to map Port of Houston through the flows and dynamic forces that are coming through it. And that's what we were trying to push the students and ourselves as well to figure out how do we define Port of Houston as landscape, because, you know, a lot of that is predicated upon how we visualize Port of Houston as landscape. So it started from the mapping techniques and went all the way into some design proposals. So what's unique and interesting about Port of Houston vis-a-vis other national ports, such as Port of Los Angeles, Port of Miami, Port of New York, New Jersey, and Seattle, and here you look at Port of Houston, you can immediately see the difference, how vast and expansive it is in terms of its land ownership. And the reason being is that, unlike all the other ports, the unique quality of Port of Houston is the fact that it makes land. All of the sedimentation that's kind of running into Buffalo Bayou eventually has to be dredged out and results in formation of islands in the bay. And so all of these shapes in yellow and orange that you can see on the screen is what port has made over the years of its operation, which is completely remarkable when you think about, you know, kind of real estate creation by the sheer fact of this entity's existence. And another interesting kind of point about the port throughout its history is, as Kinder pointed out, it started out at Houston downtown, where, you know, Buffalo Bayou Park, I guess, ends now. And over the years, because of the limitations of draft, did not allow larger ships to come in. Port of Houston moved from downtown on the left of the screen to its current location, and kind of the dynamic changes, they keep on going, and urbanization currently is encroaching on the edges of the port from the west, and draft limitations are still pushing port operations to the east, because, you know, as you know, ship technology is constantly changing as well. So in the meantime, the dredging operations keep producing this, keep making these mounds and these lands and these islands in the ship channel. So, you know, this kind of conditions created underpinnings for our approach to the project and selection of the site, because obviously in 8 weeks' time we cannot take on 40 miles of ship channel and adjacent lands, and we really had to be strategic in what would be the most kind of beneficial areas of study for us and for the students as well. So because of this encroachment from the west and this expansion to the east and to the bay, we thought that kind of this opposing sides on far edges of the port would be most affected by the change. And therefore, we wanted to take on those sites that were anticipating change to happen to them going forward. And we brought, you know, and we were interested what would happen if we brought landscape architectural approach to the logistical landscape of the port, which is never thought of in terms of, you know, parks and recreational area or, you know, community connectivity and those kind of terms at all. It just always thought in terms of logistics and industry. And we applied, you know, the principles that we would normally use in the project, such as, you know, striving to provide connectivity and accessibility, enhance legibility and aesthetics of the site, as well as creating programmatic activation to the degree that it is possible, where the communities interface with the port and where it's safe for people to interface with the port. That would make sense. And this is what, you know, you start kind of, you start applying the lens of landscape architectural methodology, and you start looking at the port site completely differently. And so firstly, we are going to look at site 1, which is closer to the core of Houston.
So as Natalia mentioned, there's many unique aspects to the port, and one of them being that it's really, what's super unique about the port and the ship channel is that it's really embedded into the fabric of the city. And so you get conditions like this, where you have neighborhood right next to industry, and you have open spaces, such as, like, in this case, Morgan's Point Cemetery, right next to the container cranes in operation as a backdrop. So it becomes a really surreal environment. And this is what we looked at was really, let's see this pointer if I can. What we really looked at was the last 2-mile stretch of the ship channel for this site, and another site which serves more of the ecological services to the east near the bay. So the last 2-mile stretch, you know, it's in a highly visible position in the city. It's along the 610 loop, which really begins to frame Houston, the Houston expanse, with downtown being centrally located. And by virtue of its scale and operation, we knew that it could become an instant center for culture and ecology. So what the students and us, what we started really looking into was how to transform these rough edges of the port, again, as valuable characteristics. And they began to inlay it with soft systems of open spaces and ecological services. And we specifically looked at these 3 opportunities within that stretch, the 2-mile stretch. The north one being more active programming that was more active programming with, again, soft, like a neighborhood park, and transforming the dredge island of the port into a neighborhood park that, again, gives back to the community. Centrally looking at transforming some of the existing warehouses into active urban programs, and then also transforming an existing program that is already embedded with one restaurant and some other neighborhood activities, and really amplifying those characteristics to, again, serve the neighboring communities. What we also looked at was introducing a green system, a green belt loop around this development that begins to really tie in, thread in the communities and also the mobility systems that exist around there. So, as Natalia mentioned earlier, knowing that the north side of the ship channel has the potential of being obsolete almost, as we look at the post-Panamax era, where the ships are getting pretty large to even be able to navigate the northern part of this area. So to really look at orchestrating urban development in terms of understanding what sites would be available in the future and what sites are available now, so the Port of Houston can look at embedding a program that could really begin to think in terms of the near future and also maybe 30 years from now, where they begin to occupy this part of the site that is an existing port function. So again, just embedding programs that begins to kind of address community needs while giving Port Houston an identity within the city of Houston. And also introducing kind of exciting programs that begin to frame arrival into the port, a gateway experience that begins to not only frame Port of Houston, but also frame the visitors' sort of understanding of their own city, understanding of how the port operates and how the surrounding neighborhoods are kind of meshing with the port. So this is an observation tower being introduced with the pedestrian bridge that you're looking at over here. So here's the observation tower. There's opportunities to introduce a port museum, and also look into phasing commercial and offices and existing kind of port sites. The second site that we looked at within this zone was really occupying existing warehouses and converting them with, converting them with programs that again begins to address nearby communities, but also makes the city of Houston aware of the opportunities that exist on the port. The north side of that area, we looked at introducing more branding and identity opportunities, really amplifying the rough edges of this port environment with just simple, paint strategies and some structural kind of modifications to the bulkhead. And we also looked, this is where we converted the warehouses into commercial and retail opportunities. And again, this is really trying to activate the waterfront. So the students begin to really understand how do we, some of them actually came from business and finance backgrounds, so they understood like development strategies. So they were really interested in seeing how this could, again, amplify this part of the port and how this becomes part of a sort of something that actually supports Port Houston's functions at the same time. So embedding it with, waterfront strategies that begin to introduce physical characteristics and borrowing design strategies from the port kind of environment, and altogether just bringing the city of Houston and the surrounding community to the waterfront, which an opportunity that is not currently available at the port, specifically for security reasons, but we also worked out a strategy where we could redefine the kind of boundaries and the security fences to kind of give access to the waterfront. This one just, begins to introduce other additional programs to kind of amplify existing kind of community and activities that are there. And ultimately, we looked at how do we introduce a branding monument that begins to give Port of Houston a new identity that is more about working with the community and introducing ecological services that benefit the surrounding communities.
Hello, everyone. This is Michael. I'm going to talk about the ecological framework, which are the islands to the east. These are, we think, a good both complement and counterpoint to the what Anna just showed you. The more kind of urban water edge condition that's being transformed by the encroachment of the city. This is a completely different opportunity, both in terms of the project, but also in terms of thinking about future landscape architecture practices of making land and working with a sort of tabula rasa condition. So thinking about kind of what is the landscape experience out towards the bay in this kind of vast landscape? This is a real thing. It's not a rendering of a proposal. This is the San Jacinto Monument. It's taller than the Washington Monument. It just sits out in this kind of, wildish kind of scrubland landscape. You can see how power lines are crisscrossing across the landscape. So there's not really this acknowledgement or reverence to the visual, quality of it. It's not, like the Washington Monument, for example, where it's super maintained around it. It's got a kind of a rough feel. But the idea is that, right, it's very flat here, and so it forms this vertical moment where you can see a landmark, and then the idea that you can go up in it and look out over the landscape and see where you came from and see new destinations. So there's this idea of moving up and down in the landscape to orient yourself and get a sense of what the landscape is and the systems and flows that move through it. And these are views out the top. Again, it is on an axis, but it's this kind of degraded Washington Monument feel of the landscape. So it's not maintained to that high level, but it is a memorial landscape that you have to drive out to, and it's disconnected from a lot of the cities and communities around it. And this is Baytown Nature Center. This is another idea that we use in terms of interpreting the landscape. This is a suburb that, through excessive pumping of groundwater and or oil, it subsided. It basically sank into the bay, and so SWA many years ago converted it into a nature park, and so it's where nature is kind of reclaiming this suburb. And so you can see this juxtaposition of, in the foreground, nature reclaiming the site, and then in the background, you have this layering of the industrial forms, this industrial vocabulary. So it starts to kind of take on this idea of, picturesque scenography, where you have kind of detailed moments of comfortable nature up close, and then you have sublime moments kind of painted in the background. And so we think this is a cool interpretation of that kind of scenography. And so how does that get translated into, a workable principle for our project? This is Avia Island, and so this is another artificial island. It's, I think, produced by Audubon. It's basically designed to maximize migratory bird populations landing and nesting on it. You can see that when you zoom in, what first appears as like a riprap edge are actually just a high density of shorebirds. And so this is kind of the testing ground for creating a diversity of habitats that are going to attract different types of migratory birds. And there's a lot of parameters that go into the kind of design and siting of this. So, for example, you have to be a mile offshore so that I guess a coyote can't swim to it and eat all of the babies. And then thinking also about the kind of proliferation of industrial forms, designed, engineered to be highly efficient. They're not designed for their aesthetics, but how can we take that and create a vocabulary which we can then use to kind of intervene in and tune the landscapes that they're producing on the islands that they're creating. And so we take this simple kind of circular extrusion of these tanks to use as a departure point. Again, it's this idea of creating legibility in a landscape that is artificial, it's created by people. So how do you let visitors know that it's not a natural formation? And so thinking about abstracting those forms in terms of how they're going to start to produce programmatic opportunities out on the islands. So thinking about oyster reef restoration, shelters, bird blinds, bird perch circles, reusing the tanks, controlling planting patterns through various arrays and forming patterns out of that, and then stormwater management. So again, very simple, but when you begin to aggregate and interface these with other systems, it produces a very kind of simple and workable way of inserting program and form into the landscape. And so here you can see the next level of development of that, putting these in a landscape to begin to provide opportunities and destinations that exist out on islands. So another kind of critical difference with the island site from the urban site is that you have to actually have a reason to go out there. You have to take a boat, you have to know it's there, you have to want to go there, and so creating programs that are going to draw a diverse segment of user groups. So we'll look at some of these as they're deployed. So this is Atkinson Island. Morgan's Point is on the left, where number 1 and 5 are. What happened, Morgan's Point actually used to extend out, and if you can see my mouse, it was connected. They sliced through it to kind of optimize the ship's path so they didn't have to go all the way out and around. And then gradually over time, Atkinson Island has grown from the continuous deposition of dredge that they use as one of their placement facilities. So thinking about how, one, you can kind of advertise Atkinson Island with a vertical landmark, and then 2, how do you get people out there with programmatic opportunities. So thinking about branding, using the Newport logo as maybe a balloon, which serves as a visual marker in the kind of horizontal landscape, taking that idea of the San Jacinto Monument and converting it into a port brand. And then this is looking from Morgan's Point, so on axis. So if we go back a couple of slides, so if we're driving on the road, putting that balloon on axis so that it creates a focal point, and you kind of know that that's a destination. And one thing that's interesting here on this roadway on the north side, which is the left of the image, you have port terminal with the kind of heavy cranes and machinery. And then on the right side is the actual town of Morgan's Point. So that's on the south, and then the container terminal is on the north there. So this idea of then moving over to the island, going up into the balloon and getting a view, vantage point out across the islands in the bay. Here you can see, again, deploying that kind of simple vocabulary to begin to modulate planting patterns, so you can create this kind of striking visual land art with planting on the island. They have to go through a dewatering process as part of the dredge placement, so they kind of have to sit there for a while, and so we think that this could be a potential phasing mechanism that serves as a kind of land art to think about planting with some subtle geometric interventions that help to stage people's use of that. And then you're back on the ground here. You can see the port balloon up in the air. In the distance, you have these cranes that are in kind of sublime moment, and then there are these transmission lines which crisscross through the bay, and so thinking about how those could become activated through application of color. And then again, using these simple industrial forms to modulate the planting so that it's a kind of field of native plants which are going to also help to attract different bird species on their migratory paths. The power lines, kind of thinking of that as an index in terms of, it's a conceptual art piece, so painting them red. This is moving north from Morgan's Point through the kind of cut of that peninsula into an island. And so you can see, thinking of that intersection point as a gateway where these two transmission poles are painted and kind of play up the entrance of a ship from the bay into the ship channel. And then looking back out from the hot air balloon, you can see this kind of iconic bridge paired with the power index transmission lines. We talk about places for people a lot at SWA, so we think about places for birds, so how our non-human animals, our constituents as well, taking the simple geometries and creating bird perch circles. Again, trying to create a diversity of opportunities and habitats for all the different types of birds which migrate through here. That fosters people who are interested in ecotourism. Bird watching is a huge driver of the economy when you start to look into it here. And then looking south down the island at other opportunities. Watching ships kind of come and go is a big thing. They're these massive objects which are pretty sublime to look at. So taking an idea from Morgan's Point, where we saw this slope stabilization, and thinking about that as maybe becoming an amphitheater type scene where you can come, have a picnic and watch the ships go in and out. And then thinking about the amount of oyster reefs which are presently in the bay and the role that they play in terms of water filtration, but also food and habitat production, and again, starting to make that into a publicly accessible amenity. Thinking about bird blinds, again, some birds are social, they don't mind people coming right up to them. Others are more shy, and so providing opportunities for different user groups of birds and people to interface in meaningful ways. And then finally, Houston is Space City, so we have, NASA and this idea that we want to celebrate that. So what if we made an island with the Fort Houston logo that you can see from space? So this is an example of what that might be. It's very ecologically friendly. What we've included are a lot of different habitat types. You can see marina so that people can access it. I think that's kind of where we are. Okay. I think at that point we're going to open it up to questions. So we're going to unmute you, and we'll
or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions?
I have a question.
Fran, do you have any questions?
Yes, I have lots of questions, but I'll start with the first one, which is, Amna, you were talking about the various sites that were, that 2-mile stretch that's kind of, on the western side. And I was really curious about how the port responded to the second of your 3 areas, the one about warehouses and, activating them and sort of bringing potentially commercial, retail, people activation down there. Are those warehouses sort of defunct? And
yeah,
what was the support? How did they receive that? I'm just really curious about that.
Actually, they loved it. That was when we took the tour with them. Those are the cotton mill warehouses that have been abandoned, and they really wanted to keep the structure and amplify its characteristics with other activities and urban development. So we had several meetings, maybe 2 meetings, or instead of 2 meetings, where we presented our ideas to them, so they knew clearly what we were about to present as well. And they loved it, so did the chairman. They felt that as an opportunity to really bring the community and visitors to the port. And it worked really well with also rerouting some of their security fences to allow access to the waterfront.
Yeah, and the port is really confronting the reality of receding to the east, and internally they are having discussions, what they are going to do with this defunct real estate that's no longer serving as general cargo to the full capacity because, the ships cannot get to it, or, it's not, it's conveniently located along the channel. So a lot of the ideas that we built on actually came from the directors at the port itself. They are not familiar of how to diversify the use of their land holdings, in terms of making it part of the city fabric. So they really relied on us to take some of their initial thoughts about what's possible and taking it further and, developing it into a vision. So it was a very collaborative process throughout.
Oh, interesting. That's really interesting. So following on that question, one of the things that I've noticed about ports is that, well, I mean, obviously, when you have land use policy, typically you don't see, residential abutting port and the kinds of quirky uses that you all showed in your presentation. One of the real limiting factors is the logistics, right? So you've got all these trucks and trains moving in and out of there. I'm curious, to what extent did that movement of, products from, port to their land destinations, how did that impact the work you were doing on these sites? How big of an issue was that for you all?
I mean, it's an ongoing issue, and if nothing else, the traffic around the port is going to densify, in the coming years because of the arrival of new chemical and oil and gas chemical companies and oil and gas refinery sites. So that capacity is not going to diminish. However, the urbanization around the port is not going to dwindle either. So there is this growing inherent conflict between the adjacency of the communities near the port and the port operations going forward. And I think what needs to happen right now and what hopefully will contribute, like in real life terms, is figuring out that relationship and figuring out how to create a landscape architectural approach to buffering or mitigating negative impacts of traffic and industry on surrounding communities.
There's also the logistics of dredging, which is what they actually fund majority of their port industry off of. Like, they go to the politicians to actually request for money to be able to dredge. Like, that's what their port kind of depends on. And so they have many sites around the port that are either dredge islands or areas that are filled with dredge, and you have to sort of orchestrate the future of these kinds of parcels because they will become full capacity at some point. And after they become full capacity, 30 years passes, it becomes developable land. So there's another sort of logistic to kind of consider that becomes part of not only the sort of the movement of boats and ships, but also the idea of like dredging and then parcel development in the future.
I was going to say, the other thing, Fran, that's interesting is that as oil prices go down, what that means is that it's cheaper to make plastic or resins. And so there's been this huge boom in the making of resins in Houston out of oil. And they store them in massive warehouses. They put them on ships and trains and trucks. And it's funny because we've gone to these kind of these logistics and infrastructure conferences, and it's this funny dynamic between the shipping people, the port people, the railroads, and the trucks. They all like need each other, and they all hate each other because they're all competing for who can move resins from Houston to California the fastest. And so it's just, you get exposed to these funny conversations that you never knew existed, in the world. And the other thing, too, is our work with the Downtown Freeways projects ties into this stuff as well, because all of those freeways are being widened, yes, partly for commuters, but also so they can move trucks, and we're moving trains around and all these sort of things. So it's all meshed together.
Another question, who owns that land? I mean, is it port jurisdiction? Could they go ahead and make these changes if they wanted to, or is it city land? I mean, how do decisions get made about the disposition of the parcels along the waterfront?
Yeah, well, it's I guess technically owned by the port, and port is composed, the leadership of the port is composed of representatives from the city and the county, so it's all very intertwined. So I guess the decisions are not made in a vacuum, but at the same time, port does have this authority to create like strategic real estate planning for themselves, kind of quasi-independent from the city. So it is a interesting governmental operation that is also for profit, and dealing with that type of client, it really highlights the complexity of these relationships in our region.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me, just their openness. I mean, it's also an enormous port. The ports I'm familiar with tend to be on bays, and so you don't have a 40-mile long, sort of land area that you're concerned about. So I'm curious too about security. You all mentioned, Amna, I think you mentioned it when we were talking about warehouses. How does security concerns for the port interface with the work that you all were doing about, accessibility? What kind of concerns did you encounter?
Yeah, the concerns that we encountered, well, there is the national security aspect to it. So there's, because of terrorism and because of international ships coming in, there's definitely heavy security. However, it's again about addressing the phasing strategies, which we keep calling the post-Panama era, because as the boats become larger, there's parts of the parcel that will sort of pull back from the west side towards the east side, so you'll free up that portion to the public, even though it may be port-owned property. However, just looking at, when we looked at the current situation, what we looked at with them was rerouting their security fences and security boundaries, and looking at the logistics of how they use their current parcels to allow for some of this development to happen. So we're not obstructing any of their current functions and not being disregarding any of their security aspects that they currently have in place.
Oh, great.
So we really did work with them to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, no, the pictures are terrific. I love seeing the photograph of you all of the group with all of the people at the presentation, and also the early photograph of you all with the port client, I mean plural, I guess, client. Interesting. I have another question. I mean, but I don't want to hog the floor. Does somebody else have a question? Okay, well, I'll ask my other one then. So, I'm looking at this document, and I mean, I have the document here. I looked at and I was looking at the images that you showed. They're really poetic and beautiful. And I'm curious how the work you were doing was received by the port, which are typically, engineers and logistical people. Did they think this was kind of fluff, or were they really, what was it? Tell me about their reaction to the work that you did.
I loved it. I think that, so Rich Burns, who's the Chief Infrastructure Officer, he's a really, I would say, open-minded, kind of visionary person for them, and I think he really appreciates the sort of storytelling and narrative aspect that we generated with it, because what it does is it creates the sort of PR piece for the port, because what they're trying to do is, advocate for themselves in the best light so that people will vote for initiatives which send funding to them in a way. And so, like, you guys get it, it's as much about PR as it is about design. And so, for them, it's I think perceived as a huge win because it helps put a face to the port. It helps communicate what they do in terms of island creation, which is creating a lot of ecological services and habitat for the birds, and they're also trying to create urban waterfront for people to access. So one of their major issues is it's right embedded within Houston, but yet people don't see it, it's invisible. And so I think for him, showing a path to accessibility and visibility is a big deal.
I would say though that so there are voices like him that see that if the port's going to grow, expand, and get money, you have to promote it in new and unique ways. But there are other people there that feel like, hey, we're a port, and the idea of converting warehouses into entertainment retail is abhorrent. That's the worst thing you could ever do. It's just like, I don't know if you've seen season 2 of The Wire, which I just started watching recently, but it's totally that. On that show, they're trying to get their port dredged, the union is, and they don't want the developers coming in and building condos where the grain elevators are, right? But the grain's dead. It's never coming back, but they're still fighting it. So there is that real kind of tension there, between people. It's like, we should just put, it's port. We got to do port things, whether it works or not.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, do you think it's likely that they will move forward with any of these ideas that you've presented? And if so, which one do you think they would move on and why?
Yeah, as we've mentioned, we've been engaged by the port in an official way to help them set up a framework for upcoming master plan effort next year. And as part of developing table of contents of that master plan, the new chapter that was added partially as a result of our involvement over the summer with the students and with the port is real estate development on the waterfront and access. So that wasn't even a component of their thinking, because primarily what they're interested in is calculating container terminal capacity in year 2035. But with this thinking, with our, I think, work that helped them visualize the potential of some of their current land holdings, they felt much more comfortable introducing this possibility into the future, because ultimately they're looking to spend billions of dollars on operational upgrades going forward. And in order to advocate for that level of spending, they have to go through very arduous economic analysis and a lot of scenario planning, that comes from many experts. But they are starting to steer it beyond just, scenario planning that focuses around container versus tank farm versus general cargo. So I have this land, which one of the three is it going to be? Now they're adding the fourth, which is access to the waterfront. Who knew? So it is really great to see that, and implementation of such ideas is probably not likely to happen for many years, but that thinking embedded in their strategic planning, I think, will definitely influence the future. And secondarily, you can approach their sites at a very small scale. You can think in terms of traditional beautification of their edges. That's easily achievable. I think they were all getting excited about the fact that just a gateway monument can be nicer looking, like some simple stuff that will not present the international port of this, of this size and significance in this kind of, aesthetically unconsidered way that it is now. So it's both kind of big, visionary thinking, but also very practical beautification thinking that we feel will be introduced into their planning going forward.
Great. This is great. Thank you for sharing. It's a really nice piece of work. Also curious about how the students felt about working. How did it work out engaging them as a project team?
I mentioned that they love figuring out each other's strengths and weaknesses early on, and then working as a team. And so they didn't feel this individual pressure put on each person to deliver, a full set of, possible skill sets that you're supposed to have. It was and so leveraging each other's talents towards a better outcome, and we thought it was really kind of rewarding process for both ourselves and themselves, because they, we started with kind of little idea of what project outcomes we were going for. We were formulating project definitions through research. So the first 3 weeks were really crucial to co-jointly define those projects. And they were as much a part of it. In fact, they did all the groundwork for us. And we just kind of helped push it. But it definitely felt like kind of a professional environment, and rather than like a student semester or summer studio type of environment. And they had to stretch pretty much, because, this is challenging and it's unprecedented in many ways.
And a lot of the groundwork that they did initially for the 3 stages that we talked about, infrastructural, logistics, and ecological, they did some beautiful diagrams and analysis that we're not even showing here, or it's not even in the book. So at those stages, they were really embedded in the subject, so it made it easier to kind of transition into making it a real design kind of output project.
It's an interesting approach. I mean, I want to talk to Elizabeth and Renee. We're in San Francisco taking a look at, some waterfront property here. And I think the approach you came up with is really, it's really interesting. I liked how you kind of turned it on your head. I think, Natalia, maybe it was you who said that, or Kinder, maybe it was you, instead of, us working for the students work for us. And the product's really the product's really impressive. I love how coherent it is.
Yeah, Fran, if you're going to be engaged with the summer program there, I would encourage you guys to not do the old-fashioned thing we did, which look, it's great for students. Some years we've gotten a bunch of those students to join SWA, but most years we don't. And so, even from the point of view of like a great, recruiting resource, it's not really that. Some years are an exception. But I think what it is, it needs to be a great resource for SWA to explore something that SWA is interested in, and potentially for us to try to turn it into a real project in an area that we don't currently, we're not doing a lot of currently.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying is really smart, Kinder, and I would love it if you would be willing, you and Natalia, and maybe you, Michael, as well, would be willing to share your experience a little bit more with Renee and Elizabeth. And we've met this morning as we're pulling together the whole poster in the program. But I think actually this approach, it's a real. This will be the thing we're working on will be a real project for sure. Yeah. I mean, we're just in early because of connection.
The other issue that we found is that that traditional 4 weeks of work, nothing happens in 4 weeks. The first week, those guys are running around trying to figure out who they are. The second week, they try to figure out how to work together. The third week, they do some sketchy things. And the fourth week, you jam it together in a PowerPoint. And it just, if you look back over the years at what we've put together, I don't want to belittle what we've done, because we've worked very hard for those 4 weeks to make as much as we could. But I think the difference of having another 2 to 4 weeks on it is just a huge, huge difference in what you can make, and then therefore what the actual effect of it is.
Well, the other thing is they have, the students who are leaving have this really fantastic product that they can take with them and feel a sense of collective ownership of it. And that's different than taking away a small little scheme that you might have done quickly. I think there's something about contributing to a really beautiful piece of work like this. But it would be interesting to know what their
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Fran. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm done.
Okay. I was so impressed by many things, but one of the things was how easily it seemed to me listening to you, and this is the second time I've heard some of this, that the approaches that you're used to using in your everyday work seem very applicable to this unusual site and this unusual typology. Did it surprise you that it was within the way that you're used to working that you needed to approach this?
Well, I was going to say that you can do your bit, but for me, I only have, so many ways of working, unfortunately. And so you kind of go to what you know and you do it, right? So we look at it, one is let's analyze it, right? And that's going to send you in a different direction because just when you analyze a port, it's a very different kind of thing. But then we do tend to jump into, well, let's design it now, because that's just what we do. What you have to do, and so this was the other thing with the students, is that students are used to doing student work, which means everything's a great fantasy. There's no client, right? You can just kind of do whatever you want. So they did jump in and start doing that kind of student approach, for a week there. We had to redirect them, like, wait a minute. Our client's going to think this is crazy, because remember, this is a real client with real money and a real port. And so I think that also was kind of going back to how you normally work, which is with a real client. But that resulted in a better product than this kind of, just fantasy thing.
Yeah, because you push against the real world conditions and limitations of daily practice. And I think for the students to be exposed to that and to be able to defend their work in front of people that are very skeptical because they run this, multi-bazillion-dollar thing, and they look at us like, we're like proposing like foo-foo pieces everywhere. It is it's a challenging thing to climb, and for us as well. And developing, learning is much about communication and messaging as about design.
And that's also a benefit, the 8 weeks instead of 4, it allows a deeper client relationship to develop over that time. Even though it's so short, but we felt like we created some meaningful relationships within that have carried forward. And I would also just say back to your question about, working in ways that we kind of work in. I think between the 4 of us, we each have very different complementary approaches, and so kind of tackling this, abstract thing through those 4 lenses was also allowed it to kind of evolve into what it was. Because it wasn't one driving ideology, it was, looking at it through different scales and different kind of modalities that allowed it to develop. So.
We also, the initial 4 weeks, Michael and I had meetings with the students that we understood that they're coming from like a heavy academic background. So in the initial weeks, we actually held meetings where we kind of looked at the port in a critical way and had a critique on the position of the port in the city, and we had pulled out academic articles that they read, and we held discussions about it. Then, we began to kind of dive into the realistic mode of what port is and port as a client. So it helped to kind of transition from the sort of academic perspective to the reality of working with the client, a real client, and producing ideas that really merge well with what they're kind of looking for.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Not for me.
Well, thanks everybody. We enjoyed.
Thank you so much. We're gonna.
Yeah.
I was going to say we're going to post a recording of this for people who missed it. And I know I probably will look at it again. Really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the red button. The left top rectangle.
You still in call?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.